Hello and welcome to Pressure Point. I'm Valerie Dudoward. Our topic this program is sharing the salmon. In order to help set the stage for this often very complicated subject, we're going to take a look at a clip from a film called Saltwater People. It's by Gary Marcuse and available from the National Film Board. So we'll just take a look at that.
It is now the moon of the sockeye salmon. The salmon are coming back from the sea.
Our native people were very sharing people. They smoked and dried fish as far as you can walk up in the direction of the great rivers. The reason for smoking so many and drying so many is that one day you want to share these things that you have with some people they will invite. So it was really not only for their own use, but to share their resources with the other tribes.
Each band have his own section of land, and there's a law for all Indians to make good to look after the land.
The Fraser River is a powerful symbol to First Nations people. It both represents and actually contains a life force that is often referred to as being spiritual, cultural, and physical. The meaning of it has been compared to that of the meaning of the buffalo to the Plains Nations people. The Fraser River, especially the lower Fraser and other areas of the West Coast, have also been the locations of some heated exchange in recent years. Various groups include First Nations people, commercial fishermen who also include both First Nations and other people, sports fishermen. There are various players in this whole scenario. And our program also features two very special guests who I have in studio to help talk about some of these things and maybe bring about some type of increased awareness and understanding. I'd like to introduce Howard Paish to my immediate right, who is from the Fishing Institute of B.C, and also Dennis Brown from the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. Welcome both to the program. I'd also like to say that in our program this time round, we had initially scheduled a third person who was unable to attend, much to all of our disappointment, and that is Ernie Cray of the Lower Fraser Fishing Authority, who was unable at the last moment to join us, and we've decided to carry on and see what kind of discussion we can generate among the three of us. So I'd like to begin, maybe if I could ask either or both of you to talk a little bit about the salmon itself. I think that's a really good point to start. What is it about salmon that makes it such a complex kind of species to understand?
Well, I liked your introduction, Val, in terms of the spiritual thing. Perhaps those of us in the non-native society haven't perhaps got the same tradition or the same length of attachment to salmon, but I know that the people in the commercial fishing industry are very close to it, and it's more than just a job to them, it's a way of life. And if nothing else, I think it's important from the environmental perspective, because we often say in the industry that the salmon are like the canaries that they used to put down in the mine shafts in the old days when the canary would keel over because of problems in the mine. You knew it was time to get out, and I think if we start seeing trouble with our salmon, we also know it bodes ill for the whole of our world.
I think that holds true for all the people involved in it. I mean, sport fishermen, a lot of them are, they could buy salmon far more cheaply than they can catch it. And it's that link with the resource and the link with the waters. You know, I've discussed this a lot with native people, and they don't have a corner on the spiritual link to the rivers, especially river fishermen and, well, ocean fishermen too. The feel of the water and just being there. And it is a way of life.
So what about the actual salmon? Can either of you talk about describe their life from?
Well, they're an incredibly complex resource, as you've said, but I mean, very simply, there are 5 species of Pacific salmon that come into British Columbia rivers, and they have their origins. They spawn in some 1,200 fish-producing streams and tributaries. There are probably 6,000 or 7,000 different stocks among those 5 species. They lay their eggs in the rivers in British Columbia. These stocks have been tuned into those rivers since the last ice age, and each one's developed very discreetly. And the fish spawn, the eggs hatch the following spring, and then for varying amounts of time, some go straight out to the river, out to the sea, the pink and chum salmon, where they depend on the estuary, and gradually migrate out into the ocean, then come back in 2-3 years. Other species stay longer in fresh water, some up to 2 years, some even up to 3 years. And they go out into the ocean, and they go way up to the Aleutian Islands, halfway across to Japan, which is where you hear all about drift net fishers intercepting them. Then they come back to the river of origin and go back to the same gravel bed, the size of this studio, to spawn. It's just an incredible thing that, you know, we talk a lot about the science of fishery management, but there's so many huge holes in our understanding of fish that that's what makes it so complicated. And well, Dennis can pick it up. They tell you the kind of contributions they've made to our lifestyles and our livelihoods.
Well, the only thing I could add to that, aside from sort of the scientific background that Howard touches on, is just that they're such a symbol of tenacity. I mean, when you think of these little fry hatching in the gravel, they got to swim down a river. Sometimes they have to encounter power dams and turbines. Then they get into the estuary where they have to live for a certain part of their rearing as they make the transition from fresh to salt water, and there's all of our human impact there, pollution and sewage and all the rest. Then they get out to sea and they face a host of natural predators, whether they're seals or what have you, other fish. Migrate, as you say, halfway around the globe, find on virtually right on time to the very day, return back to their home streams and have to go through all sorts of intercepting fisheries, sports fisheries, commercial fisheries, high seas drift net fisheries. Then all the abuses of the river again, the current of the river itself, on and on and on, and then they get up and manage to, just within days of dying, to reproduce. And it's a symbol of tenacity that can't be equaled anywhere else in nature, I don't think.
So how do you think, in both your opinions, our stocks are doing? I know this is a very broad question to ask, but as a person who comes from a family of both commercial fishermen and also people who gathered food fish for cultural and food purposes, I still find myself hearing so many statistics batted around and so many perceptions of how healthy our stocks really are or are not.
Well, I'd say they've survived far, far better than we as a society at large deserve. They seem to be a very forgiving resource. You know, when you think of the way in which we've taken our watersheds apart a lot of the time, the way in which we pour waste into rivers and so on, and they still keep coming back. They're an incredibly resilient resource. And I think, you know, what always encourages me and why I'm an optimist about all of this is that we know that we can do things if we want to maintain that rich abundance. That, you know, Dennis said it's the canary. If things are well with the water, then things are well with the people who depend on all that. If the salmon are coming back, that's a good sign that that system, that that watershed, that system is in good shape. And if we can watch out for the coho and the chinook and steelhead, then it's a symbol that we can watch out for other things, including ourselves. You know, in an increasingly urban society, we lose touch with that. That's the reality. You know, the reality of all this whole business isn't a bunch of people making plans or even sitting in studios talking about it. It's being out on the river and understanding it right there, where you get that sort of mental and physical charge of being close to it. And that's an important thing for people. Apart from the fact that it's a very rewarding thing. It maintains a viable industry. It provides a lot of people with healthy outdoor recreation and fulfills very real cultural needs for you know, for the First Nations. And cultural needs for all of us, I think.
One of the also messages that sometimes seems to come out, and I hear this kind of phrase quite often in the so-called mainstream media, I guess, is that there are more and more people chasing an ever-shrinking resource. And I guess that often we hear this in terms of commercial interest.
It's one of those misleading oversimplifications, quite frankly. Indeed, there are more and more people because there's simply more and more of us, and indeed more and more people are getting involved, particularly in recreational fishing, because we have a limited entry program for commercial fishing.
And what does that mean for the layperson?
Limited entry means that there's only so many people can hold commercial fishing licenses. In other words, it isn't everybody can't just go down like it once was at one time and just get a commercial license and get into the business. I mean, it's far from perfect, our licensing regime, and it's perhaps not even at the optimal levels or in perfect harmony with the resource itself. But by and large, it's fairly well administered. But I think it's a bit of a mixed question, because in some areas, our salmon resource management has been excellent, and we're actually starting to see returns of certain species of salmon to levels that are akin to where they were almost before we began to see modern society impact on the resource. I'm talking pre-Hell's Gate slide in the Fraser River, when we lost a major part of the Fraser River stocks and so on. But in other areas, and this is where Howard and I will often depart and end up in a bit more of an adversarial role, when you get into some of the smaller stocks, particularly what we refer to in the commercial fishery as more oriented towards the recreational fishery, the Chinooks, the coho, and the steelhead, they're in somewhat greater problems than are the pinks, the chums, and the sockeye. So I think you have to deal with them by stocks and maybe even by region and by particular stream, rather than making an overall global statement that salmon stocks are in trouble. Certainly I will say this much: compared to the East Coast and compared to most other fisheries around the world, the salmon fishery in British Columbia is relatively healthy. And that's because, in my opinion, it's been a common property resource that was able to avoid some of the pitfalls that have happened in other areas where corporate or private ownership over the resource led to overfishing and overharvest. I think we all have a social stake in this, and there's pretty good management infrastructure in place that's kept us from some of the worst excesses that have been seen around the world.
The very nature of the resource forces us to treat it as a common property resource.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, common property resource means that it belongs to all the people. These fish belong to all the people of Canada. And they allow the people that Dennis represents, and the rest of Canada allows the people that Dennis represents and the people I represent to use those fish. But basically, that's what common property is all about. They belong to the people. And it has to be that way. They're an international resource even, because they get out into international waters. They get mixed up with fish that have their origins in Alaska, Washington State, Oregon. That's why we have complex international treaties. And it forces us to manage it as a common property resource for everyone. Dennis's comments about the weak stocks. I think that's an area where, with increasing understanding between the sport and commercial people and the Aboriginal people, we can fine-tune our fishery management, different methods, different fishing by areas. There are all kinds of techniques being developed that we can take care of those weak stocks, because some stocks historically, there were always probably 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 times more sockeye in the Pacific watersheds than there ever were steelhead. And they're always just, fish like pink, you think in terms of 10 million pink salmon coming back, when you start to count Chinooks in the thousands. And so if we want to harvest those pinks and sockeye, and this is the problem that we've had with the commercial fishers occasionally, you have to manage those fishers in a sensitive way so that sometimes just a few thousand of a particular stock of a weaker stock of fish can get back. And we're talking more and more about it, but not just talk. I mean, there are action programs taking place right now.
Could you talk about even one of them that would help us?
Oh, an excellent one. It'd be. I'll talk about it. Although it's things that Dennis's group have done. There's been a conflict for years at the mouth of the Skeena about the gillnet fishery there. In order to catch the abundance of sockeye that are a result of these enhancement measures that Dennis is talking about, they've had a serious impact on Skeena River steelhead, which was a magnificent, historically important sport fish. And the confrontations were looming. It was a question of one fishery or the other was going to give. And now we'll be moving into the second year of all kinds of experiments that reduce the effectiveness of the nets insofar as steelhead are concerned. The steelhead swim in the upper portions of the water column. You just have the net sinking lower. You have gear modifications. You have means whereby you can catch the steelhead, keep them alive in tanks, and release them upstream.
Last year, for example, all of the gillnetters that fished at the mouth of the Skeena were required to have a live tank, a pump circulating fresh water in it and covered so that the sun didn't bother the fish. And then there was a transport vessel that came around and picked up these fish, and then when the fishery was over, they were released. Unfortunately, despite the praise that we received from some sectors of the recreational community and a relatively good performance level on the part of the commercial fishermen who naturally had a certain resistance to this and a fear, there now is some doubt that program will go ahead, believe it or not, because of the lack of government commitment and government funding, which really irritates me beyond belief.
Are we talking about the federal government?
Yes, DFO.
Which means fisheries and oceans.
Yes.
This is an area that I wanted to get back to some degree, I guess, that you feel comfortable talking about it, which is the common property idea or philosophy fitting in somehow with what seems to be the way of not just the future, it is looming, it is imminent, which is the whole movement towards self-government of First Nations. So how do these jurisdictions become coordinated?
Well, perhaps I could try to make a quick stab at that. First of all, I think that there is no problem within the common property fishing vision that we have of Native people being ensured of their, first of all, their fundamentally and what I believe constitutionally protected right to fish for food. That will never be argued by any commercial fisher, and I haven't seen anybody on the scene argue that point. But there is a problem if we are going to presume to have some clear understanding, at least at this stage in history, what it means to go one step further and begin to commercialize those rights.
And is that not being done now?
Well, it is being done, and that's not to in any way reflect negatively on Native people themselves. I am reflecting negatively on the government, which has done this, and it's done it in a way that's been a rather flawed and very faulty interpretation of what jurisprudence we have in place to date regarding what the rights are under the Canadian Constitution and in the Canadian court system. Now, I understand very well, and if Mr. Cray was here tonight, he would hasten to point out to me that the courts don't necessarily provide Native people with their Aboriginal rights, that the Aboriginal rights resided long before any courts or any non-Native courts or political system came upon the scene. But nevertheless, this battle is still being defined through the courts, one way or another, willy-nilly, with varying effects on either side, and it's not clear. Up until now, the government has taken the position that the Sparrow case in 1990 has made a fairly definitive statement on that. We believe that the Sparrow case did give very clear directions to the government that they had a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that Native people had their food for social, ceremonial, and societal purposes second to none except for escapement. There's no argument, and we recognize that. But what we have not yet got, and it's still before the courts in British Columbia, is a clear direction on how you may expand opportunities for Natives to make economic gain from whatever kind of resource sharing we're going to come about with. Now, the commercial fishing industry has said what we'd like to see is an affirmative action program based on something along the lines that the Native Brotherhood of BC had originally put forward of a major effort to bring Native people to higher levels of participation in the fleet, in the fishing fleet as we know it. Other people are counterposing the idea of what is known as the Aboriginal fishing strategy, which is a commercialized version of what we used to see as the food fishery in the inland rivers. It's very complicated and whatever, but what we're seeing is that what we're really having a problem with, though, Val, is this idea that somehow or other that you're going to be able to protect a commercial fishery under the Constitution the same way as you could protect the food fishery.
You mean the commercial fishery for native?
The new commercial,
Yes.
the new emerging. And I could tell you right now that I have a sense in my guts that there's room for that new commercial fishery. There's probably fishermen outside that will want to drag me up for that, for having even said that. But I think it would only be on the basis that it be done in the same context as any other commercial utilization of the resource, that it can't hide behind special constitutional provision or exclusive rights. I think if I could summarize, and I better be quick here, is that we believe in affirmative action on this issue, but not exclusivity, where all of a sudden you take what we both, or we all agree, was a very good system of common property and now say, well, there's a portion of it now is only available to people of a certain ethnic background.
Well, I think the point that Ernie would make if he was here is that, and I don't know where Dennis's scheme accommodates this or not, Ernie would point out that the so-called industrial solution, where you make allowances for greater Aboriginal participation in the conventional commercial fishery, and don't forget 25% or so of the commercial fishers and a larger percentage yet of the shore workers are Aboriginal people. They have a very healthy stake in the fishery resource now. But the point that Ernie would make and other Aboriginal people would make on the rivers is that historically their Aboriginal right involved catching fish in their traditional areas on the river. And that's where most of the arguments come. Well, certainly a lot of the arguments come. And there's no question that there can be, just the mere sheer numbers of nets in the river can pose they can pose real problems. The nets are non-selective in the river, and you have complicated management systems, international management systems, to take care of those Fraser River fish, even when they're in Alaska waters, and we've got to try and manage them all the way down. And when you get to the last in line, and those fish are on that last run there, that survival instinct that Dennis is talking about takes over. That last in line time is the point that you've got to be very, very careful as to how you manage them. And this is the big worry, that you nurse and baby the fish all the way down so that they're in the river. And then what I happen to think is quite legitimate aspiration for native nations to want to take those fish in their own territories traditionally, then that's real. But it has to be managed so sensitively. And what bothers me the most, to pick up a point that Dennis is making, is that the people who are trying to implement that Aboriginal strategy from afar in Ottawa, coming in with their briefcases and fancy plans, haven't the foggiest clue as to how that system on the ground works. The reality of our fisheries is what the film probably described, and what Dennis and I were talking about, these fish spawning in the rivers, going out this big, coming back this big, and having gone, tens of thousands of miles in order to do it, and gone through that whole gauntlet of fisheries. That's the reality. And we got a bunch of guys coming to us with a bunch of paper plans, driven by a political agenda, who really believe, they really believe they're fooling themselves into thinking that that is the reality of fish management. And there's an awful lot of people out here, all of us now are telling them, hey, that ain't so.
Well, I'll go one step further than Howard, because he's always a diplomat, and I'll say that I think it's a very cynical agenda that's occurring here, and that I think it's a political junkie, spin doctor type approach to this thing, which suggests that we had a real bad disaster in Oka. We've had a horrible treatment of Native people traditionally in this society, and so what we need before the next election, hype, sure, is a real quick fix to make it look like we're doing something for Native people. So bingo, The first place they went looking was the West Coast fishery, and now we've turned this thing into a constitutional psychodrama, which is out of control. It's got beyond the level of where Howard and Ernie and I, who can talk fairly reasonably as three individuals, we're now frozen into hopelessly polarized position, everybody defending their turf, and the dialogue that Howard's referring to has gone right out of it, and I'm quite resentful of that, because I'm not particularly interested in enhancing the fortunes of Kim Campbell or whoever wins the Tory leadership and their next chances at election to assuage the guilty conscience of the people in Toronto or Ottawa or elsewhere in this country who have no stake in this thing, who are quite happily to say, well, let's look after our Indians, let's give them a few fish, and that'll be all we'll do. We'll put the rest of land claims and all the issues back on the back burner after the election's over, but let the fishermen out in BC pay the price. And I think what's really happened here is it's been badly mismanaged. It's been hopelessly forced into a polarized situation. We're portrayed as by the federal government, not by the Native people. And I really want to strongly emphasize that, because I believe there's a range of settlement. I think there is a very, very good opportunity here. There's more that meets the common ground than really divides us, but it's the context which has been thrust on us. First of all, the AFS, if I can use that term, the Aboriginal Fishing Strategy, wasn't done in the kind of model that Howard, and even this dialogue we're having tonight, where everybody got down and talked about their feelings about the fish, their perceptions, their hopes for the future. What it was something that was done behind closed doors. Even the Native people themselves weren't fully consulted on it. It was dropped on the world, and then we're all supposed to take sides and hope that somehow or other this is going to be our answer. And it's actually gone the worst, further away on a social basis, and last year the stocks were seriously jeopardized because of the confusion regarding management and enforcement. The whole idea last year of co-management on the river was one that I don't think works very well. It's probably the toughest thing for us to accept. And that is that you can have a whole bunch of little districts or independent groups managing a resource that Howard referred to that travels thousands of miles around the globe and has so many sensitive pressure points, to use the term of this program, along its life cycle. You have to have one regulatory authority. That's
what really worries me, is that you know, you've got something like last year there was something like 80 fishers agreements reached. And there were a lot of good things in a lot of those agreements. Only 3 of them actually dealt with fish for sale. But, you know, as you get more and more harvest, you know, harvest quotas, etc., tied in with these agreements, it just gets infinitely more complex. And although it's really desirable to have the Native people closest to the origin of the fish, and keeping what I was talking about earlier, being involved in management and so on, that has to fit into some master plan that Canada can deal with in terms of dealing with the United States. And that's one thing that really bothers me, and certainly that's where I'm devoting a lot of my energies on this whole thing. I don't want to horn in on the argument or discussion, whatever it is, between Dennis and Ernie and the Native people on the sale of fish, because that's not really an issue for us. But what I want to dedicate my energies to, and I know Dennis and the commercial fishermen and the natives want to do this too, is back to our title, that what we're all perceiving as a problem and what government has set up as a problem for us, we got Morona's attention, hopefully Kim Campbell's attention. Let's try and turn that into an opportunity.
Thank you very much to my 2 guests for joining us in studio. It's been an excellent discussion, a good jumping off point for discussion. For Pressure Point, I'm Valerie Dudoward.